In this lecture, we're talking about classification and space-time systematics, and this is going to be essential for the completion of your second homework assignment, which involves you creating your own typology. One of the main goals for archaeologists is determining what did people do and why did they do it. But before we can start asking questions like that, we need to first determine the when and the where by defining a framework that allows us to explore patterns over space and time. And this is where space-time systematics comes into play. But first, the concept of a classification. So if we were to examine these photos here of different pieces of underwear, we can start to see patterns. So we might recognize that there are different colors. So we could group the red underwear versus the white underwear versus the blue underwear. We could group them based on the shape. So thongs would differ from briefs, from boxers, things like that. Now that's us putting like with like. So we're creating these sorts of categories, or what we might call types. These are groups of artifacts, features, or different ecofacts that share several attributes that we can recognize. By defining a series of comparable types, we are essentially creating a typology. So the sorts of attributes we were just discussing for the underwear here would allow us to create a typology of underwear. Good typologies have two things. The first is that they attempt to minimize differences within a type while also maximizing the differences between types. So you need to determine the level of lumping or splitting, sometimes is the terminology we use within archaeology. Do you want to accommodate more things within one type and have it broader categories, or are you going to split things up a bit more thinly? Second, good typology must be objective and explicit, and that means that it can be replicable by other researchers. That comes back to the scientific method again that we discussed earlier in the semester. Types of types. The first being morphological. Now these are artifacts that are grouped by their overall similarity, but are not functional or have any chronological significance. So these are descriptive and abstract groupings. So there's no function ascribed to the categories that we're creating. And they are abstract enough to apply to many similar artifacts without each artifact itself being its own category. That's not going to be very useful either. Second type of types is temporal, and so this is when a morphological type is found to have chronological significance. So we see it occurring in the same layer before the next type. We know that there's that sort of chronological relationship, that type A comes before type B in this case. Sometimes we refer to these temporal types as time markers or index fossils from more of a paleontological view. The last type of types are functional types, and so these are classes of artifacts that perform the same function. And these tend to cross-cut morphological types, and they may or may not be temporal. So let's take a basic ceramic assemblage, which is what you will be doing in your homework activity. We have here, the first thing we can identify are morphological types, and so those are defined by common forms, as you see them labeled here: plates with plates, bowls with bowls, jars with jars, yada yada yada. Well, perhaps we can start to recognize some sort of progression in forms. So maybe, this is the earliest plate type, a middle range plate type, and then the latest or most recent form of plates, if we were to start recognizing that within the stratigraphy of the site. Then lastly, we have what are called those functional categories, and that would be maybe separating the assemblage into cooking versus serving vessels. So the jars or other large bowls would be for the cooking versus plates and dishes for the actual serving of food. Creating types means measuring different attributes, and so these are specific, measurable, and irreducible characteristics of the artifacts themselves. And what we're trying to do are look for similarities and differences among the attributes that are used to define those types. In order to do this, some examples would be different measurements you can take, as you can see in the images here, material types, the design or style of different artifacts, or maybe even how certain appendages are attached. So the handle on this jar vessel, for example, or the way the notching is done on different lithic artifacts. We can apply a lithic typology then to several sites, and that allows us to start understanding chronological patterns. So in this case, we're seeing Clovis points as the earliest, progressing through time to these really fine small points later on. These are the morphological types that then have a demonstrated temporal significance. So why use classification? Well, knowing how and when material culture changed over time and space is the first step toward explaining why those changes occurred. And again, this comes down to how archaeologists divide space and time. Well, when it comes to dividing space, we think of culture areas. These are large regions that are defined geographically and by general differences in cultural traits. So eastern woodlands material culture is very different from things in the Southwest. Within a particular culture area, though, there might be archaeological cultures or traditions, and these are more regional manifestations within a culture area that are marked by a set of specific cultural traits. The naming of these different geographic or spatial divisions, however, are archaeological constructs in most cases. They're not necessarily categories that were relevant to past societies. However, we're doing our best to capture or understand those differences to the best of our ability. When it comes to dividing time, we talk about periods. These are temporal divisions based on general changes in easily observable material remains. So house forms, the way sites are organized, subsistence or exchange patterns might go into the definition of different periods. Typically, these are changes that are observed at a regional scale, so across several different sites. Whereas there also is the finer division of phases, and this involves a set of traits that distinguish contexts from one another. They tend to be more spatially limited to a specific locality and provide chronological limitation to the briefest interval possible. And this is when those temporal types come into play, items of material culture that show pattern changes over time, and we can define where we are in time based on those. This is the chronological sequence for Hohokam, which is the region that we are located here in the Phoenix Basin. It's divided into periods that you can see, but then there are specific phase names that are associated with the Phoenix Basin sequence, and that would be different from the Tucson Basin sequence, but I didn't include that on here. Now, how all of these phases are defined are by the material culture themselves. So we can look at different house types and how those progress through time. Also, pottery types help us, and public architecture, so the shift from ball courts to later platform mounds in terms of monumental architecture. These are the sorts of patterns that we can look at to understand temporal change. When it comes to combining space and time, we have what's called an assemblage. This is the collection of artifacts that were recovered from a specific provenience, and so that can be scaling from a specific strata or feature all the way up to a site. It depends on how you're going to define it. There are also then components, and this is what we interpret to be a culturally homogeneous unit within a single site. So it could be a sequence of deposits that we've grouped together because we think it represents behaviors or other things that were created by a people that shared the same culture. And so you sometimes find sites that have only one, what we call a single component site, versus other sites that have multiple components, like what you're seeing in the figure here. So the material culture and what we've defined as component A at site 1 is similar to what we observe in the, I'm guessing, upper sequences of site 3, but we don't see it at site 2. What we see at site 2 is that component B is earlier than component A. And in this case, component B is preceded by component C. So we're starting to understand the sequence and the relationship between different sites based on similar material culture and how we've grouped it. Yes, so exactly. So you can, assemblages are grouped into these sort of site-specific components, and then components from nearby sites are grouped into what we call phases. So these figures are showing us, spatial differences from left to right, as well as going up in time. What it's helping us to illustrate then are how material culture is grouped into these phases, which form the basic unit of space-time systematics. So phases are specific to a time and place. They help us to track spatial and temporal changes in human behavior, and generally can last about a few generations or up to centuries. It depends on the level of data and what you can learn in different regions, and that varies archaeologically.